Hello and welcome everyone to our very first installment of what we hope becomes a monthly podcast of great interest, TN Truck Thought, or the Triple T podcast for short. In this podcast, we'll be talking with some of the brightest minds in trucking to get to the bottom of some of its most challenging issues. We'll be talking about all things trucking, including what's new in government and research, as well as practical and theoretical discussions about important issues like the rise of nuclear verdicts, or how to overcome this crazy supply chain or driver and fleet safety issues. In each episode, we'll take a deep dive into these areas with carefully selected experts and also give you a fresh take on some of the biggest trucking news stories of the month. I'm your host, Sean Garney, co-director of Scopelitis Transportation Consulting, and welcome to our pod. Without further ado, I'd love to introduce our guest today. First up is Bill Zenk. He's principal and practice leader with TrueNorth Companies, where he's been for 17 years. As I understand it, he does a lot of things with TrueNorth, but one of his passions is data. Bill, you want to take a second to introduce yourself?
Yeah, Sean, appreciate it, and good to be part of the inaugural podcast here. Been with the company for 17 years, primarily focused on working with executive leadership at various transportation and logistics companies, helping them build out strategies around their enterprise risk financing or insurance procurement, and then also how they manage risk. In the last 7 years, there's been a building need where companies have needed more strategic and consultative support around how risk is managed in their business. And so that prompted us to build out what we now call risk solutions that I head up as practice leader. So good to be here, Sean. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Bill, for coming. Next up, everybody's favorite, Bert Mayo. He's VP of Risk Solutions, a friend of the industry and a friend of ours. He's been in trucking for more than 30 years, getting to start as a driver and is working his way up. I was recently reading the intro to Ed Miller's book, Trucker's Tale, good friend of our next guest, Steve Keppler, and he suggested that he gave a presentation once and asked everybody in the room whose family was in trucking before they got in trucking. So I'm going to ask that to Bert, but then he asked a follow-up question to those that had family in trucking, and he said, whose daddy told him not to join trucking? And so I'm wondering, Bert, if you can give a little intro to yourself and tell us if any of those apply to you.
None of those. It's interesting you say that. I saw him at a TCA or ATA years ago, and I remember him asking the question, who had been a driver, and half the room or 3/4 of the room had raised their hand. And he said, who of y'all have told your kids not to get into trucking? And the same group raised their hand. And I find that interesting as we complain about lack of drivers, lack of people in the industry, but we have yet to perpetuate that within our own family. So it changed my mind about it quite a bit. So it was an interesting statement. But no, I got out of the military like a lot of veterans and decided to drive a truck. So shout out to all the veterans. Appreciate y'all doing that. And drove a truck for a while, moved up into dispatch ops and got into safety and been on the insurance side of things for 25 years and came over here to TrueNorth about 8 years ago. Met Bill and his team, and they were building this thing they call Risk Solutions, and it was different, and I wanted to be a part of it. So how I got
Well, that's fantastic. We're looking forward to your perspective here. Last but certainly not least, of course, is Steve Keppler. He's a 30-year industry veteran, and I'm pleased to call my partner here at Scopelitis Transportation Consulting. Steve, tell our listeners a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Sean. Very happy to be here today with everybody. Great topic we're talking about. Yes, I've been in the industry 30 years, most of it in trade associations, but I did start with FMCSA back years ago, doing compliance reviews and roadside inspections and audits and all that fun stuff, enforcement cases and regulatory work. Then I joined ITS America Transportation Technology Association, and I was with the Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance for 16 years. The last 6 as its executive director. Then I went to Intermodal Association North America for 5 years or so in the intermodal side of the business. And I've been with STC now for 8 months and real happy to be joined with you, Sean, and great to be part of the team. So,
yeah, that's fantastic. I think we're going to have a great conversation today. We're going to be talking about the value of safety versus compliance. And I think the folks on the pod today are going to be a great complement to each other. We have Bill, who's kind of an enterprise viewpoint sort of fella. fleet solutions kind of guy. We got Bert, who's got experience everywhere, including as a driver. And then, of course, we got the cop in the room, Steve Keppler, who's going to tell us why compliance is so important. So without further ado, we'll just kick it off. And I think, an important part of any one of these conversations is to sort of set the stage, right? We need to define some terms, make sure we're all reading from the same playbook. So, with that, I think I'll kick it over first to Steve to just tell us, how would you define safety and or compliance?
Well, I think compliance is a minimum, right? Regulatory compliance is a minimum. Their regulations are structured typically not to an individual. It's for a general topic and general application across a group of individuals. So the regulated community, there's a process. Regulations are established, notice and comment. So often based on data, sometimes not. And where safety is a lot more, right? In my view, safety is not as much from a regulatory perspective. Safety sits on top of it. And so safety oftentimes isn't based on regulations. It's based on practice and procedures. And safety is different for everybody. It's different for individuals, different for companies. You don't see a definition of safety in the regulations because of that. And just because you're compliant doesn't mean you're going to be safe, right? So, and the government is typically the entity that requires you to comply with the regulations. It's a government responsibility. There are consequences from the government for not complying with the rules, fines, penalties, CSA scores. They want you to be safe. They expect you to be safe, right? Whereas on the safety side, your employees expect you to keep them safe. Your insurers expect you to be safe, right? Your customers expect you to be safe. There's consequences from those entities from not being safe, right? So you can have unproductive, disgruntled employees, difficult to recruit people if you're not. It's a safety is a differentiator, right? So, and higher insurance premiums or not being insured at all and lost customers. So I think there's certain differences for sure, but that's just a couple of points.
Well, and I want to push back a little bit because that's what I do as the host on the idea about whether or not there's a definition of safety in the regulations, right? So you and I interact with a lot of carriers on a regular basis, and they all have different safety ratings, right? Satisfactory, unsatisfactory, or conditional. Could that be considered a definition of safety, or could we use CSA as a definition of safety? I'll let Steve go first on that, but I'd love to hear Bill and Bert's viewpoint on that. Bert's chuckling right now. We can't see it, but I'm sure he's got something good to say. So, what do you think, Steve? Is a satisfactory, a rated satisfactory carrier safe?
According to FMCSA, yes. But that definition is based upon regulatory compliance, right? So that's the foundational element of all of the things you talk about, whether it's the safety rating, whether it's CSA, it's all compliance focused. Now, there's time and other things that can for CSA, there's time and there's severity weightings, right? So there's been some research, right, that have looked at those particular things. And in the rating process, they have acute and critical regulations that some are more severe than others, but fundamentally it's based upon compliance.
Bert?
Yeah, that's exactly what I guess I laugh at is, been in it long enough to see the CSA, the beginning of CSA. And at the time there was some conversation around within the industry, if motor carriers get too focused on compliance, do they lose safety? And we've seen that happen. We see that happen all the time. Although I will say, kind of back to Steve's point earlier, I do believe basic compliance is you have to start every program there and then build upon that. But I do see some motor carriers spend too much time on the compliance piece and they can lose sight of the safety piece.
Yeah,
so I guess to answer your question, I guess directly is, I don't think safety or compliance equals safety.
Yeah, that's interesting, Bert. And we had an interesting conversation this morning with another colleague of ours, sort of to that same point. Now, Bill, if you're going into a carrier and you're trying to understand their safety posture, if compliance and safety are unrelated, sort of where do you start? What are you looking at to try to gauge safety And are you using safety ratings and CSA scores?
Yeah, it's a component. If you go back to my personal definition of compliance versus safety, I kind of think about it as, compliance, there's a time to be specific. And with safety, it's a little bit more aspirational. And so your definition of safety starts to get really wide, pointed to this conversation, right? FMCSA might call something safety, but it's driven by compliance scores. But then when you really start to talk about safety inside an organization, it's wide ranging in nature. When we look at organizations, there's an interesting point, Bert. I don't know if you made, but there are
a lot of times Bert doesn't know the points that he makes, so we should
not at all. Rarely.
There's kind of games and zones that companies go through as they go through growth stages. And so we look at companies in kind of different growth chunks of, 1 to 10 units, 10 to 25, 25 to 50, 50 to 100, 100 to 250, 250 to 500, 500 to 1,000, and then kind of up. And as you kind of achieve what we call games and zones, early stages of young, smaller companies, it's very focused on what keeps me in business, which is I got to be compliant because every violation affects me from an insurability or being able to get customer contracts, and the same thing with accidents. As you start to mature and grow, though, that's when you start to build these more focused practices. You might have a compliance team, you might have a safety team. Maybe at a period of time, one person's doing both, but it splits and gets more and more siloed over time as you grow and scale. And so you kind of have to understand a couple things when you walk inside an organization. Where are they at from a size perspective? And then what is the leader calling what's important? Are we growth, sales, operations focused? Does safety and compliance have a necessary place, or it's part of our culture and it's ingrained? So you have to kind of understand what you're walking into, and then you have to then address, where do we need to tackle the issues? And some large organizations, to Bert's point earlier, we got to hit on the fundamentals first, and compliance is a big piece of that. But then over time, you start to get safety institutionalized into the culture of the organization. And that's where we see kind of this transformation happen. But there are reasons that can and can't happen based on the system and the structure that the organization puts around itself.
Yeah, boy, that was a lot to unpack. We'll be unpacking from that trip for a while.
We spend our focus primarily, right, is to help motor carriers get the best insurance program possible. So, ultimately, my definition of safety is their outcome, right? Are they, or crashes? So I always look at crashes, and I have seen, as I think all of us have over the years, motor carriers that perform very well, and I'll use CSA as our measure for compliance today. They perform very well in CSA, but have pitiful crash results, or at least crash dollars spent within crashes. And I've also seen the other, where they have great crash scores, great crash results, but their CSA compliance is in bad shape.
Yeah, well, I think go ahead, Steve.
No, I was going to say, because, and that's a good point to make, Bert. Crashes are complicated animals, right? There's lots of things that go into it, and they're all unique. Right. And so I think as you unpack those crashes and as you do crash investigations, you unfurl all of those things. That's why crash investigations don't just focus on regulatory compliance. There's interviews involved. There's, what are the weather conditions? What were the roadway conditions? All different types of what did the driver, what did they do before they came on duty that day? Right. So all of these things that impact on that scenario, the crash. Right. And so some of them are compliance related. Some of them are safety related. At the end of the day, but it's about decisions those individuals made, right? And the behavior of those operating those vehicles that ultimately, in the large truck crash causation study, the last critical event, right? So that's why it's important to understand, compliance is a baseline and it's a requirement. but safety is much more.
Well,
and I like that. I do like that statement, Sean, that compliance is the baseline. It's where you start.
Yeah, I do think that's right. I think I can harken back to the early fight over CSA and the idea that, ultimately what matters is our trucks crashing, right? And however you want to rate a carrier, what ultimately matters is, how many crashes they have. But crashes are inherently rare and unpredictable events. They just are. And so you've got to start somewhere. And it sounds from what Bill was saying that especially in the scenario of a smaller carrier, right? So we have smaller carriers listening to this podcast and they're thinking, well, I'd love to focus on safety, but where do I start? Right? So is compliance a fair baseline for safety? Right? And if it is, then when or where do we build on it? Right? So what do we think? Is working on compliance a fair baseline for safety? And as I've experienced with a lot of carriers, if a carrier is compliant, are they then safe? Bert?
So I think the answer is yes, but as long as the motor carrier, the people within the organization, leadership, as Bill talked about, as they go through those stages, they understand that, and I'll use, Steve, the spirit of the rule, right? As long as you understand the spirit of the rule, you're just not dotting the I and crossing the T for the sake of dotting the I and crossing the T. But driver qualification, background checks, this is one of the things I see all the time that a little bit of a heartache with me is they just do the bare minimum on the backgrounds. The purpose of the background is to find out if it's a qualified driver, if he or she is going to fit within your organization. But motor carriers have gotten to the point, because that's a compliance piece, they just, check it off to a third party. Rarely are there actual, phone calls and I get it. We're doing a lot today. I mean, and we're moving at the speed of sound, but that's the spirit of that rule was to ensure you had a qualified driver for your organization. But now you see motor carriers just check it off and move on.
Love the spirit of the rule. I've thought a lot about what the spirit of certain rules are. Going to turn to the cop over here now to talk a little bit about how we enforce the spirit of the rule. And we can even get specific. There's tons of examples out there, but let's take, the big one that people think of. Let's take hours of service, right? How would you define the spirit of that rule, Steve? And what role does compliance have in that rule set?
Well, it's a good question, and that's the challenge, right? You can't enforce the spirit, right? You've got to have black and white, and that's the challenge, right? So, hours of service is a surrogate for fatigue, right? So the ultimate goal is we don't want tired drivers out there operating on the roadways. So, the rules are there to hopefully address that, and there's a baseline, and so there's tools by which enforcement uses to evaluate compliance, whether it's ELDs or the like. And so from an enforcement perspective, things, for example, form and manner violations. Are those a safety issue? Some would argue not, right? However, those and other things that are required by the regulations help enforcement to determine compliance. And if there are gaps in those types of elements, right? If they're not doing form and manner, okay, that's a red flag. Okay, what else are they not doing, right? So they're going to dig deeper. So are they trying to conceal hours of service, right? So it's all those other things that come into play with hours of service compliance that help get to that fatigue issue. But it's not going to get you there. It's only going to take you part of the way there. Now there's a regulation that says don't drive while ill or fatigued, right? That's in the rules, that's separate from hours of service. And if you look at that regulation and the enforcement of it, it's very minimal. It's less than 0.5% of the time are drivers cited while fatigued. However, if you look at research, depending on who you talk to, that number's much, much higher than that.
But they're cited for 11 hours, 14 hours, 70. They're cited for all those lots of times.
Oh, wait. Let me jump on the cop here. They're also cited for not having their instruction card to operate the ELD, although he can operate the ELD, and they're cited for having no blank logs, which are never needed anymore.
That's right. So no, but you're right. Well, all those are surrogates, they're requirements, right? And so it's a compilation of things to help with compliance, but the ultimate goal is we don't want fatigued drivers. So that's why the spirit, and enforcement is a lot like the industry in some respects. Back to Bill's point, some are going to look at the pure black and white. Bert, check the box, right? I'm checking the box. The rule says this. They didn't do this. I'm going to cite them, right? Some cops are going to delve further. They're going to interview the driver. They're going to find out, okay, what were you doing? Was it intentional? So all of the good driver interview will lead you to intent, and that gets back to spirit, right? So, what did this driver do up to this time? Was it purposeful? Was it just, it didn't know things? So all of that takes place at that encounter roadside. And different officers are going to take different approaches based upon their experience, what they've learned, that driver interview. And that's getting back to CSA, tying it back to that. A lot of folks in industry have concerns, legitimate concerns, because there's biases in the data in some respect due to those types of actions. And that's where you get into that gray area of spirit versus letter of the law.
Yeah, I'm going to bring it back to Ed Miller's book, which again, I'm just starting to read. Shout out to Ed Miller and Trucker's Tale. But, in his forward, he talks about, that safety is a core principle in trucking, and that the folks that he knows in trucking are working their hardest to be as safe as possible on the road, right? And so we've got good rules like can't drive while ill or fatigued, or what's the other one we like, Steve? 96 or
396-3A1, the broken truck regulation.
Yeah, make sure your truck ain't broke, right? So, but it sounds like we're agreeing generally that that's not enough, right? The rules say you can't drive while under the influence, and in fact, you can't do drugs, right? But then we've erected a pretty significant sort of scaffolding on which to prop this rule up, which includes randoms and pre-employment and post-crash and the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse, which is a giant, paper chase kind of to make sure you're doing the right things. Now, I support the clearinghouse. I'm not trying to be negative about it, but it's just another example of sort of you start with this easy principle, and then to enforce the spirit, you erect this big structure around it. And I think that's some of the frustration that you get from carriers, right? Who are like, we're trying to do our best, but we're bogged down by our compliance posture, right? So Bill, like, how does a carrier think through that or prioritize that? Do they need to just focus on compliance until they're done, or can they do two things at once? Like, what do you think is a strategy here?
Well, I would say we typically advise, let me back up. We have the unique advantage at TrueNorth to be able to see a lot of different companies, small, large, and how they ultimately approach kind of these issues inside their organization. And so we can pull best practices out from that. And one of the things that we've identified in the last, decade or so is there is an increasing, to your all's point, amount of data to be managed. This issue around big data in and around compliance and even tied into safety is overwhelming for most companies. And what we'll see is when it comes time to spend $1, most organizations are going to spend significantly more on the operations sales side of their organization compared to risk, safety, and compliance. And so there isn't enough dollar at the end of the day to spend around people, process, or systems to manage the massive amount of safety and compliance data inside the organization. And so one of the things that we've built internally, but also just recommend as an overall strategy for companies is you have to really adopt this 80-20 principle where you're focusing on the most critical few issues that drive the highest impact results, because there's not enough people, process, system in the organization to touch everything. And the idea is if we can take, 20% effort and affect 80% of the major issues, start there, right? And so you have to understand your data and dissect it and understand where it's coming from. So the rest of it, the last 20%, usually takes significant amount of lift. And until you get that first 80% right, it's really tough to kind of complete the full circle. So how companies do that, there's new emerging resources, technologies. A lot of organizations will work with us on building out their data analytics. So they're, putting in their operational data, their safety data, compliance data, their insurance loss data into data warehouses and propping them up in different visualization tools like the operators have enjoyed for many years. And we're doing those same things in, safety and compliance. And it's starting to tell the story not only at the macro level, which generally companies are pretty good at today, or even the driver specific level, but where we think, this issue around safety and compliance is around this idea of middle of the business. So whatever that organization's middle of the business is, whether it's a terminal location or it's a fleet manager that owns a certain population of the overall fleet.
Middle of the business means like most important part of the business, largest part of the business. Can you just sketch that out a little bit?
It means that layer of the organization where there's interface between the ops dispatch side and the driving population.
Oh, lots of crossover between.
Yeah, where they connect. That's what I would call it, where they connect.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, not middle, not last or first mile, but middle mile, right?
And Sean, I've after again years being the old dog on this call, I would tell you I feel with all respect to my drivers, but that is the most important part. If there's a motor carrier can take anything away, that individual, that team is the most important part of your organization. They have to carry forward your mission statement to that driving fleet. And if there's a breakdown anywhere, that's where it happens.
Well, and I think picking up on that, and Bill, to your point on the data side, I think there have been huge advances in recent years. And for those carriers that have a data management strategy, right, there's several benefits to that. You can identify and document your areas of concern, right? And you can show people, right? You can show the company, you can show the drivers, look, here's where our problems are, right? And it's not just me saying it, I can show you. And you can also use it as a teaching and a coaching tool, right? To say, okay, here's why we need to make changes, and here's the effects of those changes. So it's not just identifying the problem, but it's also providing a solution and accelerating that solution, right?
Yeah.
More quickly.
So let's roll this back a little bit. I loved, Bill, what you talked about with, focusing on specific data points and the 80-20 rule. I think that's real instructional, but I want to press on that a little bit, right? And Sean Garney Trucking, who's a magnificent trucking company. I'm a little cash tight, right? So I don't have cameras on my truck yet. I haven't outfitted with any technology that's not required, right? I'm trying to look at my safety picture. What are the data points that you want me to focus on? And I want everybody to answer this question. I even have an answer myself, but I'm a base level fleet. I think we all see those fleets quite a bit in what we do. What are you focusing on first?
How we kind of build the out of the box strategy, Sean, for companies that don't have a lot of dollars to spend is we'll work with them on consuming the FMCSA data, their loss data. We tie in the operational data, so mileage. We'll look at turnover, and we typically prop up what we call a 4-panel key performance indicator in and around risk, safety, and compliance. And it usually is data points that we can get in the macro, and then back to we can tie it into the middle of the business. So things like accidents per million miles, CSA points per truck. We'll look at revenue per truck, turnover per truck, and try to get a holistic view of what's happening at the enterprise level, and then what's happening, as an example, at the location level. Because what we find is, the typical safety director is going to focus on what the needs of the organization are based on the data they're reviewing, FMCSA data as an example, or their loss data. What's missing is being able to coach that dispatcher in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, around what specifically is happening with their fleet. So we might have a vehicle maintenance issue in Cedar Rapids, and in Atlanta, Georgia, we might have a logbook issue. We need to be able to coach the people that are interfacing with the drivers daily, the dispatchers, the terminal managers, etc., and work them through what specifically the conversation needs to look like at their location. That's a huge component of getting ops in the safety compliance conversation, which we think is one of the major differentiators when you start to kind of transform a motor carrier's organizational culture. And what most operators do is they get filled with reams of, safety compliance data. It becomes confusing. Bert and I talk about, we've walked into terminals where there's just wallpapers of safety posters. And that becomes like, there is no message if there's too many messages. You've got to keep it very succinct and simple for the operators to engage. And those are the first steps that we usually recommend companies kind of adopt as they're going on this journey of improving their safety compliance.
So it sounds like you can start with some pretty baseline data that all carriers have, like crashes per million miles and your CSA data, which it sounds like we agreed earlier that was compliance data. So I don't want to really muddy the water here, but start with some of that compliance data and then break it up by location, which seems like sage advice. Bert, you have a few favorite data points you'd like to point out?
Crashes per million miles, always. That's my first, to go to. But we do. I mean, I'm part of Bill's team, and we look at second would be your turnover by that dispatcher, by that fleet. We believe, and I think data tells us that, the higher your turnover, the more crashes you're going to have. Also, the more compliance issues you're going to have, having to retrain that team over and over. And then we look at
is that turnover an institutional thing, or is it usually like a location specific? Are there big variations?
We push to get to that particular fleet, whatever it be, whether it be a location or a particular customer fleet. But on our dashboards, we have enterprise level, and then we break it down within the middle of the business. So then back to Steve's point, and Steve was dead on, we have enough data to be able to say, Bob in Dallas, your fleet is struggling with this issue. Joe in Montana, your fleet is struggling with this issue.
So even a fleet that doesn't warehouse all of their data and can't dive into it, there are some basic tools available to them. What do you think, Steve? You got any favorites?
I think Bert and Bill did a great job. To me, it's start with outcomes, right? Crashes clearly, performance and compliance data, and measuring that against industry averages, right? So to me, it start with what the carrier's performance looks like, and then you start having conversations, right? Asking them, do you think you're safe? If not, why not? Where are you having problems, right, in your operation? What tools are you providing to your people to help them be doing their jobs more effectively? How do they define safety? What measures are you looking at? So just basic things like that. And then, because most of them, smaller carriers coming in the business, they look at the green book, right? Okay, I'm going to do what the green book says, and that's it. And that's okay, because we talked about the earlier baseline. But you need to start transforming that cultural thinking, and you have to start with asking those questions, understanding what's their mindset and how they're approaching it, because they may not even know.
What's the role of, this is a squishy question, so maybe we cut it out. What's the role of intuition here? And the reason I ask is because, of course, I visited carriers to perform, compliance audits or whatever, and oftentimes a safety director is certain they've got it figured. They know where their problems are and they're working on it and they're about to get there, but for some reason the numbers aren't tracking. So, is there an intuitive role for safety? If you've been a driver for years and years, Bert, do you have a better knack for what makes safety, or, do you still need to conduct this deep dive into the data in order to really understand what's happening?
You walk all of us can walk into a motor carrier today, and within 10 minutes, exactly what is happening or what is not happening. And I don't know if that's intuition or experience or what it is, but it is. And when your comment about a safety director that's been doing this for a while and is almost there, I think to Steve's point, it's the outcome. What's happening? That's what you're missing. Look at the outcome, and then focus on those areas that you're trying to improve. I think the one piece we missed, or we haven't really talked about, but I think is critical, kind of connects all the dots between safety and compliance, is culture. I hate using that word because it's kind of overplayed a lot, but culture is critical. And defining that culture, all of those things are critical to all of this working hand in hand. And so when you said intuition, I thought culture, right? If the leadership is, and we've thought years, my entire career, I've thought about why does a 20 truck company, and we all know those, a 20 truck company in the middle of nowhere, South Carolina, which is where I'm from, he is what I would consider, almost outlaw. He's got the biggest, prettiest Peterbilt, stretched out, chicken lights, running wide open, but this company's never had a crash in 15 years. But from a compliance perspective, he's hiring 21-year-old. He's hiring his wife's cousin to drive a truck when he turns 21 years old. We would all shudder for that. But that's a culture, man. That driver is going to do his best for that company, that family, if you will, that culture. I think you lose that. The bigger you get, you lose that.
Yeah. Well, and that reminds me of, I was reading a little bit about safety and culture, this quote from this bigwig at Disney who said, we don't have to worry about much about compliance because we're focused on safety, and that's the culture we've built, and compliance will just naturally follow as a result of that. Do you think that's generally true? One, and number two, this is a question I love to ask because safety culture is a passion of mine. How do you measure safety culture?
I'll answer the first one with my same answer over and over. Today has been crash for your outcome, right? That's how you define your culture to me, is your outcome, and all of those metrics. And then there's probably metrics you have that I don't have, but I think it's crash outcome, injury outcome, revenue, turnover. I think that defines your culture. But I do not, in that first example I gave, I don't think safety always equals compliance. I think those small motor carriers, or even large motor carriers, are safe. But if any of us, Steve, in his past life goes in and does a compliance review, I think we find that they fail miserably in a lot of the areas.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So are we looking at the wrong things here when we're thinking about safety? Like, we keep coming back to crashes per million miles and loss runs, right? That's like the result. That is in essence safety, but we need to define that. We need to dig into that. And the only way we can do it seems like, outside of trying to measure your safety culture, and I've got some thoughts on how to do that, but it seems like the only other way to do that is through your compliance data. Is that right?
Well, I here are a couple thoughts there. I think, a lot of safety is luck, right? Bert, your example of the nowhere, South Carolina.
Yeah, we're going to cut that out, Steve. We can't say that on this podcast.
No, but sooner or later, that carrier and that driver is going to get in a crash. And so part of culture and it's that notion of, okay, look at what someone is doing when no one's looking. right? So part of it is that you've got to have key commitments from senior leadership all the way through your organization about safety, ongoing conversations, right? And scenario analysis, scenario building. Okay, what would I do in this situation? So that when that time happens where that, use a driver, and I'll use an example of the crash, the Denver crash from,
Yikes.
with the 110-year sentence, right? So that driver at the top of the hill, right, had warm brakes, right? He had warm brakes. Now, is that a compliance? It wasn't a compliance issue.
Well, he stopped to check them. That's what he was required to do by compliance. They didn't tell him how hot they needed to be.
That's exactly right. And he called the boss and the boss said, go forth and do good things. So that's an example of this differentiation between safety and compliance. That was a bad decision, right? He should not have went down that road. So, and that comes with experience. It comes with training. It comes with communication, all the way up and down, so that when those situations occur where you have to make a decision, it becomes habitual.
Oh, man.
It's not, oh, God, what do I do now? Right? Who do I call? What resource do I have? It's got to become a habit.
So another way to think about that, and I love that example, Steve, is are we conducting compliance while understanding the spirit of that rule? So in the case that you gave, like the rule is there's a mandatory stop, brake check. He did that, but did he understand all of the things that went into the spirit of that rule, right? Properly checking your brakes and knowing what the thresholds were and, getting that advice. So an interesting idea to say maybe one way that we can get safer is to focus on compliance while considering the spirit of that rule, right? Like maybe FMCSA is not always right. So let's consider why they made the decisions they made on compliance. I don't know. That's kind of a wild thought.
No, but that's at a very global level, right? Compliance is the what, safety is the how and the why, right? So this rule is here, but why is it there, right? And what do I need to do to comply with it? So it takes that another level of investigation, of training, of knowledge that you need to do, and it comes with experience.
So why am I required to get 10 years of previous employment history from the driver, but I'm not required to check more than 3? They're cop in the room, please.
Well, that's a good question. I honestly don't know the answer to that. I'd have to read the rule and notice on that. But it's a compromise. Oh yeah, at a basic level, that's right. Yeah. So I mean, right. But it's a good example because, and again, oftentimes, as we started in the beginning, a regulation is a compromise based upon input from the public. So it's a compromise based upon practice versus what is practical, right? And so, if I'm a carrier, I'm doing that full investigation because I know, and we have research that supports this. If you look at fleet safety managers, that background investigation is one of the most important things you can do when you're looking to hire drivers. That and road test, just about above everything else, right? And so you need to make sure you're because it gets down to that driver and his behavior and how he performed, and that's going to carry over regardless of whether he's complying with the rules or not. Right?
And let me, Sean, just take your role for a second. Throw this to the trucking company owner in the room. Bill, why won't you let your safety department perform a week's worth of background check on that new hire?
Why won't I? Well,
yeah, why do you demand that's done within 12 hours or 24 hours or 2 days?
Well, I personally don't, Bert, but I know a lot of companies do.
But it's your balance, right? It's your imbalance. It goes to revenue.
It is the balance, and there's so much pressure right now on every trucking company to keep and grow their fleet because of where we're at with the abundance of opportunities within the freight market, that there are some compromises and hard decisions being made at that executive level. But Steve, you said something earlier. All of this conversation around culture starts at the top and it trickles down. And one of the things that we talk a lot about is not only is there a driver shortage, and we're looking at being able to open up younger drivers to come in the industry. But back to the Colorado example, one thing you said was that driver called their manager, and that manager in essence gave blessing to move forward. And so these people that are making decisions or supporting decisions of a driver also need the same level of coaching, knowledge transfer as those drivers do. And there's a lot of young people and inexperienced people coming in the industry, coaching the same young and inexperienced people in the industry. So that's where we start to target this middle of the business conversation, where if the executive leadership team is saying, safety compliance isn't a necessary evil, but it is institutionally part of our organization, and that starts to trickle down into the business, and then how the system of the business is structured. And so I would anticipate most organizations that we've come across, this dispatch group, this operations group, they are incented on the movement of freight. Top line, right? Because everybody thinks if we get the top line, the bottom line will follow. And it does until it doesn't. And when you start to tie in safety compliance as a component of performance of that middle of the business, and you start to coach and train to it, and you maybe bonus towards it, that's when you really start to ingrain the system where everybody's playing on the same, chain and pulling in the same direction. And it's as important for that dispatcher to make the right call and the right coaching response to that driver with the hot brakes as it is that driver to sit on the side of the road and do what they need to do to prevent that, bad accident from occurring. And I think that's a major component to all of this is when companies get that right, regardless of size, that's when you really start to see differentiation happen, and those companies control that major expense in their P&L, which is, ultimately insurance and that cost of risk.
So that's a great thought. I think, Sean, picking up on Bill's point, you said you had some thoughts on culture. What did you want to share there?
Well, we've done a lot of thinking about safety culture because we have seen a lot of safety directors who are, fairly convinced that they've produced a great safety culture because it's our top priority and those sorts of things. But measuring safety culture has been super challenging, and Steve, you said it before, as I talk to my, safety director friends around the country, the way they measure safety culture is by trying to measure what's happening when nobody's looking. And some interesting concepts around that have surfaced. One is, what's the vernacular that your employees are using around operations, right? Doesn't include important safety words. But then in a more concrete sort of scenario, what are some of the data points, Bill, that we can find that might indicate what drivers are doing when nobody's looking? And two that I love. One is DVIRs. How are we performing DVIRs? How long is it taking us? How often do we do it? Right? A lot of folks have that data either in paper or using some electronic service. And the other is like those coaching and trainings. Right? If I assign a driver, hey, you got 30 days to do your training, when does that get done? Day 29, hour 11? Or does it get done early in the month? And so these safety directors that I've talked about, they try to drive those metrics because they feel like it's driving home like you have a personal responsibility to ensure safety, and it should be part of you, right? So that was a great question. I really appreciate that. I want to keep us moving a little bit here because we have some hot topics to get to as well. But I just want to touch just very briefly on beyond compliance. And so I'm going to kick it to Steve, who's going to give us kind of an update on this beyond compliance program, maybe a baseline. But then I want to hear from Bill and Bert about what tools, technologies, and practices do you think would be most important beyond compliance in driving safety? So we'll start with Steve.
Yeah, so beyond compliance actually is a thing, right? It was Congress directed back in 2015 for FMCSA to look at several items, for the agency to look for advanced safety equipment, enhanced driver fitness measures, strategies, safety management tools, technologies, and programs. And really the ultimate thing with this overarching program is to provide credit, right? Or incentivize the industry to do things beyond the regulatory landscape, squarely in what we're talking about here today, and to look at how those things could be incentivized primarily through CSA, or, they said not through regulatory relief, but primarily through CSA and SMS and score implications. And so as a result of that work, FMCSA has been doing some work over the last couple of years. They've issued several notices to get comments from the affected parties and the industry. And so they just completed a research program last month where they took more industry input and did a survey. And so they're essentially in the process of finalizing that research report. And the research team presented it to the agency. The agency is going to put out its report, and then they're going to have to report back to Congress. Okay, what did we learn? What are we planning to do here? So it's in that phase now. Okay, well, what's next? How the agency is going to respond to it, and what do they plan to do? So that's a little background and where we are. Very interesting. It's something that's been a passion of mine for a while, but certainly interested from, again, to Sean's point, Bill and Bert, from the insurance side of this, how you guys would view a program like that and your thinking there.
Bill, you want to start?
Yeah, I think once you kind of solve the core fundamentals of a safety and compliance program, we're seeing more and more companies start to talk about what's next. Technology is finally getting less expensive, and some data is building that is supporting, the examples of in-cab technology and its benefits. And so, I love it, Steve. When the government can support maybe the direction of companies in and around innovation beyond what's required to, what is aspirational, I'm a fan of it. And I do think that we're getting more and more momentum with the installation of, telematics, forward-facing, rear-facing cameras inside, inside these transportation companies. What I think is interesting, we've seen, in the last handful of years is back to data. There are reams and reams of data coming in off of these devices. And one of the things that is critical for companies is to either have a third party or internal resource prepared to handle the data and then ultimately respond to the events that need to drive coaching.
Yep.
Because it's much more significant of an impact to be able to coach in real time or in short, time frames based on when those events happen. And that does
just being prepared to collect the data,
right.
Gotta have people.
Exactly. Yeah. Yep. And having people that are competent, to be able to then get on calls, interface with the driver after those events. And when that happens, we are seeing significant dips in the events. And so there is some osmosis that happens just by way of having the tech in the trucks. And here's the other interesting data point Bert and I have worked on, back to driver shortage and, living in the macro and the driver level data. Less than 8% typically of the fleet are having activities day to day that would be hard termination type events. Most of the fleet is, either of quality, and how do we keep them, engage them, and make them, be a part of our team and culture. And the rest we just need to move them over and up. We need to get incremental gains to take C-level drivers to Bs and Bs to As. That, idea that there's this massive population that is of high risk to our organization is just simply not what we're seeing in the data. So things like in-cab technology starts to help, address the 92%. So we can quickly target if we need to move on, or there's a possibility to move over and up these 8% that are highest risk.
I'd love that.
And I think logic would dictate that approach and helping move those C drivers to B drivers probably helps with driver retention too, right? Because the driver feels like they're part of the solution. You're helping them. They're not just a commodity anymore, right? You're part of and that's back to that culture. You're as important as everybody else here, right? They're helping them.
Yeah. Bert, favorite beyond compliance tool?
Well, I guess quick hit is going to be the two that come to mind are the camera and the LMS platforms. It gives motor carrier the ability to manage a remote fleet, and also in that continuous learning program gives you ability to touch them that way. And I think those are both critical as you move forward. And,
yeah. Well, what's interesting about this conversation in relation to beyond compliance is it seems like we all agree that one of the most important things that drives safety in an organization is safety culture. In fact, that's been confirmed by a VTTI study recently, and and most of the experts in the industry. The question is, how are we going to measure that so we can get some credit where credit is due? Man. Okay, so I think we're about through. We're almost out of time. I'll pose one quick hitting question to all three of us. Then maybe we'll talk about some hot issues. So the question is, what is the single most important data point when determining a fleet safety? And I'll start with, I know what Bert's going to say. Bill.
I'm probably going to agree with Bert. So it's crashes per million mile for me. That one is the.
Bert's nodding.
Same, absolutely.
Steve?
From a measurement perspective, I would agree. Something that's easy to measure and clearly outcome based.
And Sean, Steve, you had made a comment earlier. I just want to kind of, we hear all the time, they want to know what their peers are doing. What's the industry average? We urge always, don't look at that. Look at your results. Improve upon yourself. Continuous improvement. That's the only way to get better.
Benchmark against yourself. Interesting concept. Could do a whole podcast on that one. My favorite safety data measurement is SafeStat score. I think that's probably the best if we still had it. So we'll maybe have to reinvigorate that. So with that being said, I'd like to thank everybody on this podcast today. Bill, Bert, Steve, thanks so much for coming. Of course, thanks to TrueNorth for hosting this forum and for allowing the motor carriers an opportunity to sort of listen in and maybe get some tips or tricks to improve their system. So with that, I'll say thanks for being our very first guest. We really appreciate it. To leave you with a final remark on today's episode, for every organization, compliance is necessary. But safety is vital. Thanks for listening to this episode of TN Truck Thought. If you enjoyed the topic today and want to tune in for future conversations here on the Triple T Pod, make sure to follow us. Also, please don't hesitate to let us know which topics you want us to cover in future episodes. Drop us a line in the comments section or send us an email to transportationnews@TrueNorthCompanies.com. Up next, Trucking in 10.